Here we go then.
Yeah, I can't see the list of participants, so I've got no idea.
People are starting to filter in now.
Oh, okay. Morning, everyone. For everyone joining us, we're just going to give it a few minutes or a few seconds even to let all those who've registered join us. And if Leah, if you could give me an indication when we're there or thereabouts.
Just let people filter in for a moment or two. Okay, I think you're good to go when you want to.
Great, thanks, Leah. Good morning, all, and thank you very much for joining us for this online seminar by Gabriele Bammer, titled "Can We Discipline Interdisciplinarity?" I can't see anyone's faces, but I understand that you're all there and that you can see ours. But we will, after the presentation, we'll ask people to put their videos back on, and we'll come back together so we can see each other ideally. So my name's Daniel Black. I'm from the University of Bristol. I'm going to hand over to Gabriele directly, but first wanted to provide very briefly a bit of background and specifically why I sought out Gabriele's experience and insight in relation to the work being undertaken by the research consortium TRUUD, which is aiming to tackle root causes upstream of unhealthy urban development, and so fits very well with Gabriele's area of specialism, which focuses on how you undertake research on complex real-world problems. I actually first came across Gabriele just over a year ago at an event organised by Future Earth for JPI Europe and the Belmont Forum, and that was part of a separate research programme on sustainability in cities, and specifically issues relating to food, energy and water systems and their integration. And Gabriele had been invited to do a masterclass on transdisciplinary research. And so much of what she was talking about resonated with me and the various challenges I'd been encountering over the years. So I was very pleased when Gabriele agreed to do this webinar for us. And to give you a quick overview of her CV, between 2011 and 13, she was the director of the Australian National University's Research School of Population Health. She has a range of affiliations, too many to run through, but she's been a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, an Australian National University Public Policy Fellow, an inaugural Fulbright New Century Scholar alumna, and has held visiting appointments at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government for 2001-2014. But too many to mention. Gabriele also runs the Integration and Implementation Insights blog, I2 Insights, and convenes the Global Network for Research, Integration and Implementation. I did just want to say very briefly that whilst there's no affiliation between us, Gabriele's very kindly agreed to do this, but just wanted to mention our funders who funded the organisation of this effectively, the UK Prevention Research Partnership. So I'm going to hand over to Gabriele, and she's joining us from Australia, so it's 7 p.m. and hopefully the end of not too long a day, but thank you again for making the time, and over to you.
Terrific, thank you. I'll just wait till Daniel stopped sharing and then I'll start sharing. So thank you all very much for attending. I'm hoping that we'll have a lively discussion. I'm hoping that we'll have about 20 minutes, maybe even a little bit more for a discussion. And so I really welcome your comments and questions. And if anybody wants a copy of the slides, because there are a number of resources on the slides, they're easily available. So Daniel and Leah have got a PDF version, or you can contact me and I'm happy to send you a copy. So I was asked to talk about, can we discipline interdisciplinarity? And what I'd like to do is to start by talking about why would we even want to, then to talk about integration and implementation sciences, which I've developed as a way of thinking about how can we discipline interdisciplinarity. Then maybe what does this mean for you? I've been thinking about this for TRUUD participants, but also for others who've approached me who are starting to do big interdisciplinary projects. And then suggest one way that we could potentially move forward together. So why would we even want to discipline interdisciplinarity? So increasingly funding is becoming available to tackle complex problems using interdisciplinary approaches. And I'm using interdisciplinary here in inverted commas because people understand different things by it. I'm not going to get into that argument, but it'll become clearer shortly why I am using that. It's important to say that interdisciplinarity is not a nice to have add-on. It's not something, you know, you just spend 5 minutes doing and your project suddenly becomes interdisciplinary. What I'm going to argue is that it requires its own set of expertise, and thinking about what that expertise is and how to add it is actually quite challenging. So what we're trying to do is to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, and to act on it more effectively. And to do that, building on a very solid academic base, including discipline-based expertise, so bringing together a variety of disciplines. And for many projects, also looking at stakeholder expertise and lived experience. And by stakeholders, I'm talking about the people who are affected by the problem and the people who are able to affect the problem. So the people who have no power but are impinged on by the problem, so it might be environmental pollution or it might be a particular health problem, and then policymakers, businesses, professions who are in a position to do something about the problem. And I think bringing both of those perspectives to the table as part of broadening our understanding, as well as thinking about how we can act on the problem, is really quite important. So it's no existing discipline's business to provide the tools that we need for integrating all the relevant disciplinary expertise and all the relevant stakeholder expertise. There's no discipline that has its business to implement a more comprehensive understanding of the problem in policy and practice change, to do all the background work, to figuring out, so which disciplines do we need for which problems and which stakeholders do we need, and for dealing with what I'm going to call, for now, wickedness. I'm sure many of you will have heard of so-called wicked problems. It's a particular form of complex problem. And so what always happens is that at some point the slides stop moving. So forgive me, that's just happened right now, which is always a little bit disconcerting. So I'm going to argue that there are 6 elements of wickedness that it's nobody's problem to deal with. And I prefer to call it complexity, but for now I'm going to stick with wickedness because a lot of people understand that language. So the first of those is that the problems that we often deal with are systems problems. And what that means is that they have non-existent boundaries, that emergence is an issue, that there might be feedback loops, that non-linearity might be an issue. I'm not going to talk about this because we'd be here forever. The consequence of that is that the problems that we're dealing with have no clearly defined limits. Everything's connected to everything else effectively. The second element of wickedness is the importance of diversity. And what I mean by that is that people differ in many ways, that we differ in our values, our interests, our epistemologies, the way we understand how knowledge works, our personalities. And we also differ in how we understand and define problems. And what that means for wicked problems is that there's no clear problem definition. And so we don't have an easy way of thinking about what the problem even is. So it's not connected. So there are no clear limits. It's not clear what the problem is. The third element is the importance of change. So change is happening all the time. And you might be working on a problem that's in a dynamic rapids, that things are changing really, really quickly, or you might be working on a problem that's in a quiet backwater. If your aim is not to have things change, then continuity and conservation also require work. Because we're in a dynamic environment, things don't stay still. And so if you want things not to change, you've also got to work on that. There's also inbuilt resistance to change, inbuilt inertia, so that once something exists, particularly something structural, it can be hard to get rid of. Change and improvement are not synonymous, so change doesn't necessarily lead to improvement. Whether or not something is successful is in the eye of the beholder, so it depends what you were hoping to have happen, whether or not you deem it to be a success. And the outcomes of any attempt to influence change are unpredictable. So I guess the important thing here is that control is a necessary but dangerous illusion. The fourth element is the importance of context. So this is the relevant historical, cultural, political, economic and other circumstances. It's the authorization or legitimacy that you have for dealing with the problem that you're dealing with. And it's also the importance of the institutional setting. So what limitations does the institution that you work in impose on what you're able to do? And what limitations do the institutions of the partners that you want to work with pose for what you want to do? And so what that means is that there are multiple constraints on what's feasible. I've lost count, I think we're up to 5. The fifth element that I want to deal with is the unknown. So I like to think about the unknown as an island, using this metaphor of an island. So if you think about knowledge as an island in an infinite sea of unknowns, then think about the shoreline. So as the island grows, the island of what you know grows, the shoreline, which is what we know we don't know, also grows. So rather than expanding knowledge, reducing our unknowns, expanding knowledge actually makes us aware of more things that we don't know. And I said that the sea of unknowns is infinite, and here's why: because we have continuous innovation and change. We've got ongoing research that throws up new unknowns. We've got some unknowns that we can't reduce. We've got limited methods for dealing with unknowns, and unknowns also have benefits. And so not only are unknowns unlimited, but we also have limited research capacity. You might know this particular manifestation of unknowns, so it's useful to think about what we know, what we know we don't know, what we don't know we know, and what we don't know we don't know. The point of saying all this is that there are multiple unknowns that we're ill-equipped to handle, and that's another important manifestation of complex problems. And I've got a great graphic here which isn't going to work, so you'll just get the end product. So when you bring together these 5 elements of systems, diversity, change, context, and unknowns, you also get imperfection. And what I mean by that is the solutions to these problems can only ever be partial and temporary. So there are always going to be some aspects of the problem that are unresolved, and there are always going to be some people who are unhappy with the decisions made, which is why you can never get perfect answers. And so you're always dealing with trade-offs. Okay, so that's the elements, that's what we need expertise for, to deal with how to bring different kinds of knowledge together, how to make change happen, and how to deal with wickedness. And so who's developing this missing expertise? So I'd argue that there are 2 sets of groups. There are teams who are working on complex problems, TRUUD, for example, and they do it, I would argue, in a fairly ad hoc way. And then you've got small organised efforts. So you've got the interdisciplinary community, the implementation science community, the systems thinking community, the action research community, transdisciplinary community, the operations research, post-normal science. So you've got all these small groups who've started to think about how do we pull together a common way, an expert way of dealing with complexity. But the consequence of having this, all of this, is that we've got this set of highly fragmented efforts. So it's important, I'd argue, to overcome fragmentation, because it's important both for our intellectual heft, for our ability to do scholarly work. So having more people involved improves the quality of what we do. And it's also important for our political influence. So if we want to be on the margins, being in small groups, being in no group at all is a great way to be on the margin. If we actually want to have a voice at the policy and funding tables, then it's important to bring together what we know and for that community to be at the policy and funding tables, arguing for funding to further develop what we do. And so I've been thinking about integration and implementation sciences as a way of overcoming that fragmentation. So the question I ask is, what if there was an underpinning shared discipline, or even just a knowledge bank, to provide a common set of expertise for these two sets of fragmented communities, the individual teams and then these small organised efforts? And I've suggested that I think about it in terms of a discipline, but some of you won't like that. So just think about it as a knowledge bank, which is essentially what a discipline is, and a community of practice. And so what would integration and implementation sciences look like? So I'm going to argue that it's a framework with 3 domains, the first of which is synthesising disciplinary and stakeholder knowledge. So what's the evidence? The second is, how do we understand and manage diverse unknowns? So how do we deal with the unknown? And the third is to provide integrated research support for policy and practice change. In other words, the third element of the evidence is, how do we make change happen? So in terms of thinking about developing expertise in these 3 domains, I'm going to suggest that we could codify it by addressing 5 questions. For what and for whom? What do we need? How do we do it? What's the context? How do we deal with context? And how do we know when we've been successful? So let me take you through each of those quickly. So in terms of for what and for whom, the important question is, what's the research aiming to achieve and who's it intended to benefit? And therefore, who needs to be involved? So what are the disciplines that need to be involved and what are the stakeholders that need to be involved? And I've already talked about the 2 categories of stakeholders, those affected and those in a position to act. So tools for identifying those, for prioritising them, are really important. So the second question is, what do we need? And here is where we take a systems view. So how do we scope the problem? So how do we look at all those different problem definitions and all those different interconnections that mean that the problem doesn't have any natural boundaries? And we can't deal with a problem without setting boundaries. So how do we then set the boundaries? How do we frame the problem? How do we take values into account? And then how do we harness and manage the diversity of the people who are involved? How can we collaborate together well? How can we bring all those diverse understandings into a rich picture of the problem and into finding a better way of addressing the problem? The third question is the how question. So how do we do the synthesis, the understanding and managing unknowns? How do we do the provision of support for policy and practice change? And I'd argue, if you look in the bottom corner, by whom and when do we do it? So I'd argue that there are cross-cutting methods that go across all these 3 areas, that we need to understand how to manage participation, we need to be able to do integration, and we need to be able to communicate well. In addition to that, for synthesis, there are, I'd argue, 3 classes of methods: dialogue-based methods, model, product and vision-based methods, so ways of building something together, and then common metrics-based methods. And I'm not going to talk about those because, again, it would take too long. But just to give you an indication that there are classes of methods that are useful for synthesis. In terms of understanding and managing diverse unknowns, my colleague Michael Smithson, who's done a lot of work on this, suggests that there are 6 different things that we could do. Mostly what we do in research is we try to get rid of the unknown, or we ignore it, we banish it, we put it to one side. But what we really need to do for complex problems is also to look at how can we accept the unknown, how can we work with it, rather than always trying to get rid of it. And then for providing integrated research support, so how do we implement our research? How do we support decision making, and how do we help people understand the complexities of change? It's also important as researchers that we don't become too obsessed with supporting policy and practice, that we also maintain our role as critics. It's not our role to be uncritical handmaidens and just to do what policymakers and businesses and civil society want. We also have a role in saying, some of this stuff isn't working, guys, and we really need to be doing better. So the fourth issue is around how do we deal with context, and I've already dealt with this in one of the earlier slides. Again, what's the overall context? How do we understand that? How do we figure out what authorization we need to do the research? And then how do we figure out what the facilitators and barriers in our organisations are and how to deal with them? And then the final step in the framework is that the framework itself provides useful questions for evaluation. So have we met the aims that we set out to do? Are we working with the beneficiaries? Did we choose a good systems view for dealing the work? Would another one have been better? Did we choose effective methods for what it is that we were trying to do? So let me just recap where we've come to so far. So I'm suggesting that there are multiple kinds of problems that require integration and implementation, and that some of those problems are wicked problems, not all of them. And that the challenges we have are in identifying all the relevant expertise, in agreeing on what we're going to call it, and agreeing on how we're going to socialise people into it. And I want to talk about these challenges a little bit more now. So what does this all mean for you? So what does it mean for a group of people who are setting out on a new project that's interdisciplinary, for example, TRUUD? So I'm going to suggest that there are three process challenges for the newly interdisciplinary. We often think about the problem that we've been set up to deal with and don't put anywhere near enough time into thinking about the processes for addressing that problem. So I'd suggest, and I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback on this, that the first thing is, how do you get started? How do you find what you need to do the interdisciplinarity? And how do you find out what you don't know you need? So there are a bunch of things that you know that you need. You know that you need to work together, play together nicely, that you need to be able to collaborate well, and there are tools that can help you do that. But often there are blind spots that all of us have that you might not have really thought about, and that you discover a year down the track that you really needed to pay attention to. The second challenge is, how do we do it well? And how do we know that what we're doing is best practice or good practice or building on what's gone before? And then the third challenge is, where do we contribute what we've learned about doing interdisciplinarity? So all projects will learn things along the way and we'll be able to improve other methods. So how can you contribute that? Where do you send it? Who's going to be interested? How do you find a platform for it? So at the moment, it's interestingly enough, there are no penalties for not learning from what has been done before. There are no penalties for reinventing the wheel, and there are no penalties for contributing to further fragmentation. And in fact, there are some rewards. So if in your community of whatever the problem is that you're working on, you're the first to develop or, to do this kind of work, you can get a lot of kudos for doing something that's not particularly good if you're looking at it in the broader picture. The bigger benefit for everybody is that because things are so hard to find, it's often a lot faster just to reinvent the wheel, just to do it again. And the challenge then is, how do we get around that? So right now it's hard to find, as I've just said, what's available and most suitable. And it's hard to overcome contributing to the fragmentation. So or it's hard to contribute to overcoming the fragmentation. So if you don't want to be just another fragmented piece, if you don't want to develop another toolkit, but you want to actually join together with others into a broader effort, it's really hard to do that. It's hard to contribute to a joint knowledge bank or joint discipline, and it's hard to join an overarching community. These things just haven't been set up. So I'm going to suggest a starting point, and this is founded on several principles. So the first principle is what a colleague of mine says is, let's get started and then let's get better. So it's also known as don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So what I'm going to suggest is something that's a starting point and there's lots of room for improvement. The aim for what I'm going to talk about is to be accessible. We're all time poor. We've got very different levels of understanding. We've got very different levels of access to money. So the resource I'm going to share is open access. And the aim is also to be global. The aim of this is also to be easy to contribute to, and that there's help, particularly in editing help in contributing what you've done. And what I'm going to present is what one person can do. So, you know, when I was faced with this problem of, okay, so how do we, it's really hard to do this, so what can I do? And so here's what I've come up with and that I would invite you to join. And it's the blog. It's the Integration and Implementation Insights blog that Daniel mentioned right at the beginning. Here's an example of some of the blog posts, the URL for those of you who are interested. And I'm also going to give you a bit more of a taste of what the blog offers, just to give you a sense of what it is that you could get involved in and contribute to if you wanted to do that. So the blog has really been set up to become a knowledge bank and to become a way of bringing together people from a whole range of those different communities and from a whole range of teams that don't necessarily belong to those communities. So let me give you a little bit of flavour. So there's great blog posts on collaboration, like this one about the top 10 things that you need to know to collaborate effectively. There's a tool that I've put together about how to do stakeholder engagement effectively. There's one about 3 types of knowledge that you need to do transdisciplinary work. There's one about what do you need to know, what everybody should know about ignorance, and what do you need to do to deal with unknown unknowns. As you can see, I'm going through these really quickly. As I said, the slides are available for anybody who's interested in looking at this in more detail. If you're a modeler, which is one of the great integrative tools, what are some good practices for system dynamics modeling? How can you achieve transformational change? And how can you amplify impact? So how can you scale up when you've done something on a small scale that's been effective? How can you scale it up to make large scale change? So these are some of the resources that I guess I'm really excited about. There are many more, but I wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of what the blog contains. It also contains single tools, many of which I haven't talked about. So how to democratically resolve what a group should do, how to understand why groups get to the groan zone when they're having a discussion, and a whole lot more. So I want to say a little bit about how the blog could potentially help your project. I'm hoping it can be a starting point for what you need, finding what you need, and by reading it regularly and looking at what there is in there, it can also give you a sense of what you don't know you need, right? So the blog currently has more than 350 posts. Each post is fully indexed. The indexing terms are defined, and it has an advanced search function, so hopefully things are easy to find on particular topics. It's designed to be easy to read quickly, and it's possible to comment and ask questions if a blog post takes your fancy. It can also, it's also meant to provide a way for you to contribute, right? So that for you to contribute the concepts, the methods, the processes that you found useful in your project. And these can be ones that you've developed, or they can be golden oldies that you found somewhere else and and want other people to know about that you found useful. So the median views that a blog post gets is a bit over 650, and the most popular of our blog posts has had more than 100,000 views. We currently get read in 183 of the 193 countries as defined by the United Nations. And we've got some good evidence from one of the journals that we've worked with that when people write a blog post about a method in their paper, it increases the views of the paper. We publish weekly, we've got the capacity to publish more often, and we welcome partnerships with groups who want to publish regularly in the blog and use that as an outlet. So let me conclude by saying what I've tried to do is I've tried to give you the case for why we might think about disciplining interdisciplinarity. I've tried to give you a framework that might help you think about it in a more systematic way. I've talked about the common challenges that new interdisciplinary projects face, and I've talked about how I've thought about how we might move forward to this disciplining interdisciplinarity thing, and that I'd welcome your comments and questions. If you want to find out more, there's a whole bunch of places where you can go. We've got another website as well as the blog. There's a LinkedIn group, we've got a YouTube channel, and I'm on Twitter. And there are two key open access references. There's a book called Disciplining Interdisciplinarity, where Daniel was intrigued by the title and said, why don't you use that as a title for your talk? And there's a more recent paper that 27 of us have written about this whole issue of expertise in research integration and implementation. So thank you very much. So we have got half an hour for questions and comments. So look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Gabriel. That's really great, and yeah, another incredibly stimulating presentation. I've got so many questions myself, but let's open it up to the floor. We've got a couple coming in. Forgive me, I'm not actually. Leah, can you confirm whether or not we can we hear from people, or we can't see them, but can we hear from them directly, or am I reading them out? Can you just confirm that?
There are some in the question and answer box. So they can answer live.
But people aren't able to read them out themselves?
I don't think so, no.
Sorry, forgive me. So we've got a question from Abdullah, thank you. So in some developing countries, the IDEA approach is used as a justification for outsiders to take the lead, and in this process, the discipline experts are being sidelined. So how can we do an interdisciplinary approach without it says vaguing disciplines borders? Yes, over to you.
Thanks, Abdullah. Yeah, look, one of the reasons that I put interdisciplinarity in inverted commas is that it's a term that is used in many cases to cover a multitude of sins, right? And you've described one of them, that I think one of the things that's really important in good inter and transdisciplinary work is that we respect what the disciplines bring to the table. What's really tricky is how do you get the disciplines to work together effectively without one discipline becoming dominant? But what you're talking about is the other extreme, which is that you don't respect what the disciplines bring to the table at all, right? And I think one of the challenges we have with not having a discipline of integration and implementation sciences, or having a good community of an agreed community of practice where we work together, is that we can't talk about these kinds of problems and find ways to resolve them. While we have, at the moment, we have kind of an anything goes approach. And what that means is that we're held hostage to power plays in local circumstances. And I think that's problematic. No self-respecting discipline, you know, the immunologists or the astronomers or the physicists wouldn't put up with that. And we shouldn't have to put up with it either. And we can only overcome that by coming together, by organising, and by setting our own ground rules of how this kind of work should be done.
Thanks, Gabriel. I do have a follow-on question from that myself, but I'll go on to Rosie's question. So differing understandings, perceptions of central concepts and general terminology can be a bit of a barrier to making progress in defining the directions of work? Is it possible, or is it necessary? And if yes, what are the ways that interdisciplinary teams can come to a more shared understandings?
Yeah, that's the point, I guess, Rosalie. So it's a great question. I guess part of the problem is that we don't have enough, because we're not an organised community. We can't say, here's what we need to do this kind of work well, right? And so we're always asked to do it without enough resources, without enough time, and we haven't been given the opportunity to come to these shared understandings. And so the dilemma we've got is that people are anxious to get on. I mean, we don't want to spend forever kind of before we can even get started. I mean, people want to get on with working on the problem. If you were an immunologist that wanted to get on, you'd have this whole background set of knowledge already, right? And you'd know, and you'd already have a laboratory set up. You'd already know that you needed a certain amount of money to run the laboratory well. But we don't have any of that infrastructure yet for the work that we do. So if you like, we're building the bicycle and riding it at the same time, which is a really difficult position for us to be in. And, you know, and right, so you can see, I guess, the dilemma in your question, Rosalie, is in one of two ways. You can either see it as incredibly frustrating, or you can see it as incredibly exciting, right? So it's not everybody who, you know, other disciplines don't have the privilege of building the bicycle and ride while they're trying to ride it, right? So we're in that wonderful position, but we're also trying to do it with not many resources and not much power. So it's also incredibly frustrating.
Another great point. I'd love to come back to you on that point about institutional barriers and what we can do about those. But we've had another question come in from Elson. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Another emerging concept in this space is on boundary spanners or boundary spanning. What's your take on this? Do you think we should either involve separate boundary spanners in a team, or should we rather develop boundary spanning skills to involve of everyone involved in the team?
Yeah, so I guess boundary spanners is another one of these groups that's grown up. Like the interdisciplinarians and the transdisciplinarians, there's now the boundary spanners, and they're also developing their own expertise and thinking. So Elson, so the way I think about this is that it's useful to use another discipline as an analogy. And the discipline that I find useful is statistics. So if you think about integration and implementation sciences as the equivalent of statistics. So statistics is what you would use if you were dealing with a quantitative problem. And if you're dealing with a complex problem, you use integration and implementation sciences, right? Now, we don't expect everybody to be a statistician. We have statistical experts. Some of us aren't experts, but we know a little bit about statistics. We could do a t-test if we had to, for example, or an analysis of variance. And all of us know that we don't know stuff about statistics. So what most of us have a good sense of is when we need to bring a statistician to the table. And I'd argue that what we need is the same for this, or for boundary spanning, as you've called it. So rather than everybody having boundary spanning skills, I'd say that we need experts with boundary spanning skills, the integration and implementation sciences experts. And we all need to, we need to appreciate that some of us will have some of those skills just because of the discipline that we've studied in, or our own innate characteristics. So some of us will be good at collaborating, or have high emotional intelligence, or we might know a particular dialogue method that we've learned. So we need to value that. But all of us need to know what the limitations of our knowledge are, and when we need to bring an expert to the table. So I'd argue we all need to know a little bit, but we need experts who've got a grasp of the breadth of it.
Right, thank you. Just while we're waiting for some others to come in, I've got a question of my own. We spoke previously, and you've spoken, and indeed you covered some of this in your book, but issues around bias and advocacy bias and those sorts of things. I recall, and forgive me, this is going a while back, but to your presentation, but you did focus on this a little bit in that presentation you did for the Belmont Forum and JPI Europe. Just wondering if you could just say a bit more about that and why you focused specifically on advocacy bias.
I'm not sure I understand the questions. What do you mean by advocacy bias?
So this was a terminology that you used in a previous presentation. Is this ringing a bell or not? You spoke about advocacy bias. No?
No.
Okay.
Advocacy bias.
Yes. Don't worry, we can carry it on offline. I'll come back to you. There. I've got another question then on institutional the sort of institutional challenges you've been alluding to here. I mean, given that there are these constraints in the system, do you, and there are, as you've set out, a number of constraints, then are there ways of mitigating against those? And what would you say is the best focus for any team that's sort of coming up against those institutional barriers?
So I guess there's the kind of short term and the long term, right? So in the short term, until we've organised and are much more powerful in terms of being able to challenge the institutional barriers. So if just imagine, for example, that we lived in a world where there were no laboratories, and people were trying to set up laboratories, but there was a lot of opposition to doing it. There weren't the resources for doing it. People didn't know how to do it well. Mm. You'd have to put up with, people saying, well, it costs way too much money to do this. And, how can you insist that the glassware's washed properly? What difference is that going to make, et cetera, right? So people have organised, and they, people who do work in laboratories have worked out over decades, centuries, what it needs to do good laboratory work. And we're trying to do that at a very fast speed. So one of the things we've got to do, I'd argue, is organise so that we don't have to so that we're not constantly in this short-term situation of being on the back foot, which is where we are now. So what do we do now? That's the hard bit, right? So the first is understanding what the barriers are. The second is picking your battles. You're not going to be able to fight all of them. And then mastering the best argument you can to win the battles that it's important to fight. I think it's just very challenging. And I guess there is some comfort in not being able to do anything that's perfect. And that shouldn't be an excuse for doing really bad work, right? But it should be a comfort that even if you had the best conditions and all the money you needed and all the time that you needed, you still couldn't get a perfect outcome. So let's not get too concerned about the barriers. Let's do the best that we can with the barriers that we've got. I guess that's all we can do. That's slightly problematic to say with the kind of complex problems that we face, but that's also the reality, right?
Yeah, no, great answer. Okay, we've had a number of questions come in. So the first one, a challenge on TRUUD is that some teams prefer to do individual disciplinary work first and then join up after data collection, whereas other parts of the team want to join up at the start and design data gathering as a transdisciplinary team. Is there a right way, or should the approach be guided by the needs of the individual projects?
Great question, thank you. So I'm not a purist, I'm a pragmatist. And one of the things when you're dealing with complex problems, I think, is to be able to accommodate different styles of working. That, you're absolutely right. Some people want to do the disciplinary work and then come together at the end. And some people want everybody to join up at the beginning and to find the problem together. And it's actually hard to marry those two sets of ideas. But there is a place in dealing with complex. The challenge when you're leading a complex problem is to be able to accommodate different people's preferences and still come out with a decent answer at the end. So, you know, I'm not at all opposed to what's called multidisciplinary work, which is where everybody does their own thing and then you come together at the end and you try to make sense of it. That has a bunch of advantages in terms of providing a rich understanding of the problem, because you haven't compromised on the problem definition to start up with, but it also makes integration really difficult. So there's no, so the purists, the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary purists would say, no, you all have to start at the beginning and define the problem and work together. But I'm not one of those. So, you know, I think that's, so one of the reasons why I think we need to band together is to kind of have this argument, right, and figure out what's appropriate when.
Fantastic, thank you. So a question from Anna. You mentioned that someone can present a concept from another discipline as new for their field, but it seems that there's a value in doing this for the field of people there don't know about it. Many people are not attempting ID research. So how do you think it's best to present knowledge from across fields to inform people who don't look outside of their island and immediate coastline?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So the point I was trying to make was that one of the reasons why there are no penalties for not working together is because you can get a lot of kudos for doing exactly what you said. And of course, people should do that. Of course, people should introduce things that they've found valuable into other fields. And of course, people should get the kudos for doing that. And right now, the field is in a state of development where there's more kudos in doing that than in trying to do what I'm arguing for, which is to get people to work together to develop not just, so you can introduce, I'm just going to go sideways for a minute. You can introduce a concept to a new field that's not particularly good. And there's more kudos in doing that than trying to work with other people who use that concept and to find the most appropriate way of doing it in particular circumstances. Best is a bit of a loaded term in this context because best is different depending on the context that you're working in. But you know, there's a lot of things that could be done better. And because we keep reinventing the wheel, we don't actually make progress. We just keep reinventing the wheel. And so you've got lots of different ways of doing some things, but you haven't got, the practice doesn't get more sophisticated. Implementation is a good example. You've probably, those of you who've been involved in implementation might have heard this. You know, implementation is like a toothbrush. Everybody has an implementation framework and they don't want to use anybody else's. So that, you know, that's also quite common in this field.
Right, thank you. And a question from Kyla, so forgive me if I have got that name wrong. What have you learned so far about the organisation and structure of interdisciplinary work or research in collaborations? How could this be done better? So the organisation and structure, and how are these different for virtual, online or remote collaborations, which so many of us are these days?
So Caleb, that's a short question to which there's a very long answer. So so there's a lot about how to work together well. There, in fact, is a whole science of team science, so that there's a lot that we know about how to do collaborations well. Some of it's not particularly practical. And then transferring it into the virtual environment, as you say, is quite challenging. So there are things that you can do face-to-face. If you think about trust, for example, which is one of the most important parts of collaborating. So trust relies on, apart from anything, as part of building trust, you've got to be able to communicate well. And the way that what we understand from other people, only part of it comes from what you actually say. A lot of it is from how you actually also are. And you can't get a sense of a person as easily in an online discussion as you can face to face. So establishing trust with complete strangers online is much more difficult than it is to do it face to face. So there's a whole slew of things like that that are really important. I would refer you to the blog. There's not a huge amount, but there's a little bit of information on the blog about how to build effective collaborations. And there are some people who've reflected on what they've done to try to build that in a remote setting. At the moment, because COVID's come mostly for people who have already had some face-to-face work, who've then had to move online, that's easier than just starting online. And I guess depending on how long we're not able to mix particularly easily, it'll test how do we set up online relationships between people who haven't ever met face-to-face. Really challenging stuff.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left. I've got another question, if I may, and this maybe follows on from the question about institutional barriers, but so much of this stuff, and we knew this before we started our research program, but this stuff takes time and it doesn't necessarily translate, or it could translate in outputs like papers or, further research funding, or, the incentives that are within the academic sphere. But do you have, and again, forgive me if this is sort of repeating an earlier question, but do you have a sense of, because it does require time for this coordination, it does require time to sort of legwork to do that. Do you get a sense that it's being increasingly recognised now that time is needed? Yeah, I guess that's the simplest way.
Yeah, so the thing that's heartening is that there are a couple of funders who fund what they call transdisciplinary research, who fund it as a two-stage process. So they fund the team to get together, and this is the Austrians and the Swiss, their national science funds. So they will provide funding for the team to get together, to develop the research question, to figure out who they want at the table, and to figure out whether they can and want to work together. And once they've done that, then they can apply for a second tranche of funding to actually do the work, right? And I think that's a really important development in recognising that exactly what you said, that this needs time, right? So if I can go back to the laboratory analogy, I would see that setup, that establishment time, and the ability to change and evolve as the project develops, and the need to have more time for the project than you would in a monodisciplinary project. I would see that as our equivalent to needing good laboratory conditions. Nobody questions the millions of dollars that go into setting up laboratories, right? And we need to have that same matter-of-fact approach to the time and resources that it takes to do our work well, both in setting it up, but I think the other piece of what you're talking about is that you also need it once the project has been established and is underway, because things change, right? And you find out things that you didn't know before, and you need to adjust things, and you need to bring in new people, and you need to think about, well, there's a gender component here that we completely missed, and how do we build on that? And so there needs to be that resources and the flexibility built in to allow us to do that.
Thank you. That's really great. There's no more questions that come in. I've got so many more questions, but I think to give people time to go on, they've probably all got an 11 o'clock thing, so people can take a comfort break and all the rest of it. So I just want to say thank you very much again for taking the time out today. Was there anything else you wanted to finish on before we wrap up?
No, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to everybody who participated. Feel free to email me any additional questions. And as I said, if you're interested in a PDF of the PowerPoint, you can either get it from Daniel and Lee or from me. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks again, Gabriele, and thank you to everyone for attending, and look forward to continuing the discussion in due course. Thanks all.
Gabriel, are you happy for us to share the recording with people as well?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I see we've got a final question from or comment from Krista. Leah, should we stop recording?
Yeah.